On April 18th, 1938, Action Comics issue 1 was first released, the first comic in which Superman, one of the most iconic superheroes of all time, was introduced to comic readers. In August 1962, Amazing Fantasy issue 15 was released, introducing the world to the Amazing Spider-Man for the very first time. And in April 1952, Astro Boy began its serialization, becoming one of the most iconic shonen manga of all time. All three of these characters are iconic superpowered individuals who grace the pages of sequential art books with text boxes that tell narratives similar to that of film, but on the pages of a magazine. Bro, just call them comics. You freaking cornball. Each of these figures have left irreplaceable marks on the comic and manga industry, helping to shape what kind of stories thrive in the world today, both in and out of comic book pages. But Astro Boy's discography consists of 115 chapters in total, the last few series being released in 1981. Remember this for later. Whereas Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, and many other Western superheroes alike haven't stopped serializing since their conception, appearing in thousands of comic book issues, and it doesn't seem like many of them are stopping anytime soon. And in cases where they have, a generation or two later they get brought back and they're up and running again. The majority of American superhero comics have been serializing for generations now, and while there have been significant updates to their lore and characters, for the most part, these heroes and the characters that inhabit their universes, multiverses, have barely aged. It's implied that Superman is in his early 20s in the early issues of Action Comics, whereas Superman in the current DC Comics is believed to be in his early to mid 40s right now, which means for the past 87 years, Superman has aged about 20 to 25 years. Spider-Man was 15 years old when Uncle Ben got switched down in Amazing Fantasy 15. He's only around 28 years old right now in the current 616 continuity. Whilst on paper, this doesn't sound so bad, as these are just superheroes. They're characters that were created for escapism and a quick look into fantastical worlds of powerful icons who can use their abilities for good to save the people in need from evil. Why does it matter that they age so slowly? Especially since writers can control the pace of stories however they want. And to that I'd say, you're correct. The writers can pace a story however they want. And honestly, the longevity of these characters isn't necessarily a bad thing in the first place. It's the result of what this longevity does to them, their stories, and the audiences reading them. Whilst loads of superhero comics would contain mostly episodic adventures that readers could jump into any issue with easily, like an episode of The Simpsons, comics have changed tremendously since the Golden and Silver Age. Stories have become long form and serial, as trade paperbacks and omnibuses have become the more desired way to collect these stories, meaning that continuity happens to change a lot more in more recent comics. But if it changes too much, and there's been a far enough progression away from the status quo, something needs to be done to bring things back to the place they once were at, or else it won't be as easy for new people to get into comics, and they're closing off a market. And in the case of Marvel and DC Comics, they tend to use big continuity resets and retcons as a way to do this. And more often than not, these events prove something, that these stories you love are able to be disposed of just like that. These worlds can be snapped away like it's Avengers Infinity War, and in the worst case scenarios, they can produce outrage. From the early inception of what costume superheroes were, these characters would mostly appear in monthly self-contained stories where superheroes would fight villains of the week. Meanwhile, a subtle amount of serialization would be included in these stories to show a development between certain character dynamics, new abilities, and traits for our heroes to gain. Or when old adversaries and villains would return with new methods to defeat the hero after being previously thwarted. This form of writing was pretty crucial to how comics worked in the Golden and Silver Ages of superheroes, because these stories were pretty much only readable in two formats: the collection of single issues or reading reprints in newspapers. This meant that for the publishers to gain the most readership possible, they had to make these stories as accessible as possible for new readers who may want to just pick up a random issue from the newsstand, similar to the formula of a sitcom. I'm a really big fan of the episodic era of comics, as it allows you to just jump into nearly any random issue of your favorite hero. If you had an idea of who the character was already, you could pick it up at issue 50 and not be completely in the dark. Comics only started getting collected in trade paperbacks in the 1960s and 70s, particularly with Marvel's collaboration with Lancer Books, with DC following suit in 1981. This time period also happened to be the era where superhero comics started to take a more serial approach to their storytelling, where the writers would create large-scale plots that spanned over many issues, making it more of an investment for the readers to keep up to date with the release of their favorite superhero stories, but also making it a little more difficult to jump in wherever you want in the story as a newcomer. I own some collected editions of the 70s Marvel comics, and in those books, you can see there's a narrative being told throughout maybe 2 or 3 issues at a time. However, for the most part, the stories still contain enough of their own breadth and context to hold up as good single issues. And in a way, the The large library created from these characters being constantly rebooted and retconned has allowed for this strange dichotomy to exist, where there's one side with a lot of long-form, heavily serialized comics written by writers who have had a crack at working on mainline superhero comics, and there's this other side where there's a lot of evergreen content. Evergreen content is rewatchable and reliable because it's short, sweet, and you know what you're getting yourself into almost every time, because the formula is set and structured. Highly serialized content isn't evergreen, as it doesn't last as infinitely as an episodic show could, because there's a planned progression that will start and end, where the start of the story and the end of it will feel very different. Evergreen content in comics could be deemed as short limited runs and self-contained stories in single issues. These two sides of comics allow for the readers to pick and mix from the gargantuan bibliography of comics that are available to them. For example, I've become a big fan of Daredevil after reading Chip Zdarsky's long run on the character, but because of its sheer size and depth, it's not very evergreen or rereadable, and I have to be in the right sense of mind and have the time to read it. Hence why more of the time I tend to go back and read a lot of the limited runs and earlier Daredevil stuff, such as Frank Miller and John Romita Jr.'s Man Without Fear limited series, Daredevil Yellow, or issues from the 70s and 80s. But the decades went along and the styles and desires of writers and audiences have evolved. Stories eventually became much more serialized, to the point where writers were able to progress the stories to near unrecognizable points from which these comics once started. Where Batman was once a cape-crusading detective who worked alongside the Boy Wonder going up against weekly villains, he developed into this more dark and gothic knight who cleaned the corrupt streets of Gotham, and his Robins eventually grow up and leave the nest, or in worst cases killed in action. Where Spider-Man was once a teenage superhero, balancing his life with his friends, his old aunt needing his aid, and trying to figure out how to become a man. By the 90s, Spider-Man was married to Mary Jane Watson, had a career, was dealing with several clones, Aunt May had died, and Peter was even getting ready to be a father. And where Superman was The death of Superman is one of the first major events to make big waves outside of the comic industry. It was such a big deal that it even made its way onto mainstream news coverage.
Most reports, can it be true? Superman will die November 18th at the hands of a villain named Doomsday?
If you couldn't tell by my nasally voice, I didn't grow up in the 90s, so I wasn't present for this event. So as I was researching for this video, I learned about the discourse that was taking place behind the scenes that eventually led to DC killing their most recognizable figure. Following Crisis on Infinite Earths, a story we'll get to later, comic book legend John Byrne took over the revisioned version of Superman in his 1986 series, The Man of Steel, which retold and streamlined the modern Superman origin story and changed some aspects of his lore to help new readers get into the series without having too many ideas thrown at them at once, whilst staying recognizable to longtime fans. But that wasn't all. He led the production of several other Superman comics, to the point where there were Superman comics being released every week. All these comics were very successful at the time, and took place in the same continuity under Byrne's supervision for the character. However, in 1988, John Byrne left DC Comics as he wasn't satisfied with how the company was treating Superman, particularly with how they merchandised the character to be quite straight from Byrne's take on him. This led to a large group of different writers being assigned the different Superman books that Byrne once had a hand in producing. However, there was a major lack of cohesion and teamwork between them. They held meetings that were dubbed Superman Summits, and Mike Carlin and Dan Jurgens have both spoken out about the constant disagreement and arguing that would take place with the 18 different creators who attended the summits. They would usually end with the last man standing getting the say in how they approach the next story, while Jerry Ordway would jokingly suggest that they just kill Superman. But in a 1991 summit, when Ordway made this joke once again, nobody laughed, and the writers decided to show the world what it would be like without Superman, as Carlin had believed that the world was taking Superman for granted. And to Ordway's shock, the formal pitch of the death of Superman was greenlit by DC, and in January 1993, the event, written by Mike Carlin, Louise Simonson, Roger Stern, Dan Jurgens, and Jerry Ordway, was released nationwide. The story spread across several Superman books that were being run simultaneously, where an unknown, near-unstoppable force that the characters dubbed Doomsday goes on a rampage, destroying everything in his path. The story itself isn't inherently bad or mediocre upon first glance. Since it's a 90s Big 2 comic, there's mountains of text which coincide with the action, but the writers were able to capture the stakes of this event very well, and the art is stellar if you ask me. From the jump, Doomsday is just on smoke. He has it out for the people, vehicles, cities, nature, and even animals. It's completely ingrained in him to just destroy, and because of his sheer power, nothing can stop him. When the Justice League arrive, he wipes the floor with them, and to make things even worse, when Superman tries to fight him, he has to stop Doomsday and make sure the people within the vicinity of the battle don't get killed. One of my favorite parts was when this angsty teenager comes home to his single mother from school and goes and just gives her a pretty hard time. You know, he's too cool for school, thinks that Superman's a cornball, and would rather be like Guy Gardner. But they end up in the crossfire of the battle, which traps his mother and baby sister in the burning debris where their house once stood. And in a final act of desperation and fear for the loss of his family, the kid calls out for Superman, who comes to their rescue. It's moments like these where I could see that the writers weren't just trying to shock the world with a crazy title, but actually had some understanding for the point of Superman. But although these moments did stand out, I still didn't see a concrete reason for them to kill him yet. And whilst I admit, I was speed reading a good amount of this story and not reading every single letter of the dialogue, which there was a lot of, by the time I reached Superman and Doomsday's final clash, resulting in the death of the monster and one of DC's greatest heroes, I took my time with each page turn and allowed myself to take it all in and empathize with these characters.
Like weary boxers who have gone the distance, the combatants collide in one last explosive effort. In the years to come, a few witnesses will tell of the power of these final punches, that they could literally feel the shockwaves. Others will remember the enormous crater that resulted from the sheer force of the blows, but most will remember this sad day as the day the proudest, most noble man they ever knew finally fell. For those who loved him, one who would call him husband, one who would be his pal, or those who would call him son. This is the darkest day they could ever imagine. They raised him to be a hero, to know the value of sacrifice, to know the value of life, but it's too late. For this is the day that Superman died.
Yes, big sad, I cried buckets. But this isn't 1993. Superman didn't stay dead, and you know it. Superman returned in the same year he died, where he was brought back alongside several other Supermen in the storyline Reign of the Supermen. Clark Kent returns with a brooding scowl, a black outfit, and a very 90s friendly mullet, which honestly doesn't look half bad. I wonder if David Corenswet would look cool with a mullet for the next Superman film. Photoshoppers, this is your call to action, do your thing, I want to see it. But that's not the point. Superman's death was impactful, it was shocking, but it didn't last that long. It didn't even last a year. I understand that Superman is more than just a character and he's a symbol, something too priceless to just get rid of, but it feels kinda cheap. Whilst it doesn't take away from the fact that Superman was willing to lay down his life for everyone and all the reactions and grief that the characters around him had to feel. We already knew that Superman was going to do this. He's been like this since well before this storyline. Him returning and the status quo resetting takes away the stakes of not just the story but the DC universe, because it shows us that these characters must always come back, no matter what happens. And whilst this mainly applies to the big named superheroes like Superman in the case of this storyline, and Spider-Man in the original Ultimate Comics who gets shot by the Punisher, dies protecting his family from the Sinister Six, and after a while just reappears, and also again when he dies in the mainline continuity where Doc Ock swaps bodies with Peter and lets his old body die with Peter still in it. But Peter does return as his spirit still lives on and comes back after Doc Ock gets to play hero as the superior Spider-Man. And back to DC, Barry Allen disappears in the pre-Crisis era, then he dies saving the world during Crisis, and returns after a few generations. And I believe this could probably be found with every superhero who's died at some point, and this isn't subject to just the heroes alone. Love interests, villains, side characters, a lot of them have died before and have been resurrected unceremoniously to continue the longevity and status quo of these comics. And in the next case I'm about to cover, the death of a side character was not only used to maintain the longevity of one of the greatest superheroes that we know, but also in many ways regress this character in a story that's upset many fans since its release, and has fans upset to this day. One More Day is one of the most controversial Spider-Man stories ever written. It was an event ushered by Marvel editorial to maintain the longevity of Spider-Man comics by retconning the marriage of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson to never existing by having Peter make a deal with Mephisto, who is basically Marvel's devil, to save Aunt May's life after she took a bullet that was meant for Peter during the Civil War event. A lot of people don't like this story, myself included. Not because the comic had bad pacing, dialogue, or art, but because it in many ways does a massive disservice to Peter Parker as a character. And once the context of the story's creation is fully on the table, it makes things even worse because it wasn't a story done to progress the character, but to keep Spider-Man on a metaphorical hamster wheel for as long as possible. One More Day had a lot of well-known comic book writers and editors involved in the story, such as Brian Michael Bendis, Jeff Loeb, Mark Miller, Ed Brubaker, Dan Slott, and Tom Brevoort. But the main people involved in the comic's conception and then putting it together were Joe Quesada and J. Michael Straczynski. Quesada has been known to be against the marriage of Peter and MJ, and this is because of a few reasons. One being that Quesada believes that Spider-Man being a married man doesn't allow for as much soap opera style drama that people liked about Spider-Man comics to take place.
It seems like you're almost hitting people over the head with, oh, Peter, he's such a loser again.
Yeah, because that's what Peter Parker's about. In fact, let me say something. When we were in the middle of Civil War, and things were going great for Peter Parker, and he was living in that penthouse, the letters I got from people saying, this is not Peter Parker because things don't go that well for him. You know?
You seem kind of goofy that kid like again.
But that's what Peter Parker is! Yeah, Peter Parker's not supposed to be a 40-year-old man!
One of the big appeals to Spider-Man is the A-side plot between Spider-Man doing spidery things and the B-side plot of Peter Parker doing his personal life things. But Quesada believes that unlike the college era, married life doesn't provide the same level of entertainment. And reason 2 is because Peter and MJ's marriage in the main 616 continuity didn't actually happen naturally. Simultaneous to the mainline series, Stan Lee was writing a Spider-Man newspaper strip, and he decided to marry Peter and MJ in that strip, and Marvel saw the opportunity they were missing out on and decided to marry Peter and MJ in the 616 continuity, who only a few issues ago were not together anymore because they decided that they worked better as platonic friends. And whilst I get disliking a decision like that, because it would mean Peter and MJ's marriage was decided by a higher up who wanted to impose their own idea of how Spider-Man would thrive best. Wait a second. Isn't that exactly what they tried to do with One More Day? Just in the reverse? But not to put all the blame on Quesada, from what I've read, he wasn't the only person who agreed that Peter and MJ's marriage should end. Apparently, Straczynski wasn't against the idea of Peter and MJ's marriage ending, but he was against the way they executed it. Even when you read the comic, you can see it in Straczynski's dialogue that he's silently whispering, "This is a pretty bad idea." Quesada believes that instead of Peter and MJ just divorcing and ending their relationship like normal human beings, where sometimes things don't work out the way you think, believed, or wanted, he thought it would be a better idea, more heroic even, if Peter made this deal with the devil, sacrificing his marriage for the life of another person. When you word it like that, it doesn't sound so bad, but when you look at it from a larger scope, this event retconned the entire 616 universe. Harry Osborn's back from the dead, Peter's identity is withheld, which means that a lot of people's lives and memories of Spider-Man have changed, and even the story of Peter and MJ miscarrying their child is deemed non-canon as well. The way I see it, Peter making this deal is not heroic, it's selfish. He's told by several characters with power and without power that it's just May's time to go. The universe has made this very clear. This is the way things should be. Don't mess with the natural order. Even Mephisto says this to Peter in the form of him and MJ's daughter that will now never be because of Peter's decision in One More Day. Ouch. Peter in this instant has the power to change reality, and in doing so he doesn't know how it may affect other people's lives, but he knows that he is doing a disservice to what he vowed to do in marrying MJ. He's betraying his responsibilities as a husband. He's betraying his responsibilities to the world of using his power for good. In Amazing Fantasy 15, there was always this one line that stuck out to me.
You guys are the greatest family any fella ever had. They're the only ones who have ever been kind to me. I'll see to it that they're always happy, but the rest of the world can go hang for all I care.
The rest of the world could hang for all I care. Now, this line wasn't supposed to be a showcase of Peter's good traits that he needs to embrace, but the opposite. It was to show us how much he has to learn. After Uncle Ben's death, Peter is supposed to turn away from this mindset, abandon his selfish nature, and start caring to help other people. But he is literally living out this line he said in Amazing Fantasy 15 in One More Day. For all he knows, World War III could be a result in this deal. I mean, he's literally dealing with Satan. This is only one of the many examples of how this comic character assassinates Spider-Man. If you want a really good in-depth video on One More Day, you can watch Alex Ellen's video on it, The Death of Spider-Man. You get to learn even more about the behind the scenes of the comic, and some good analysis on MJ. Anyways, due to this, Aunt May is still alive and well to this day. Another superhero that just won't kick the bucket. Wait, she's not a superhero. Or is she? But you get the point, shut up. But you see, whilst One More Day was done to change things in favor of the higher-ups at Marvel Comics, to maintain the longevity of Spider-Man and characters in his cast, sometimes things can get messy. I mean, the several continuities and different variants of characters, they break my brain like once a week. So if that can happen to me, somebody who considers himself an established fan of comics and has been reading them since he was a child, how the hell is anyone new gonna get into this stuff? In the cases of Marvel and DC, when they had too many characters and continuities with overflowing breadths of lore, they both decided to do the same thing to streamline, reset, and maintain the infinite longevity of the superheroes we know and love. They created overpowered gods to destroy universes from the multiverse one by one, so the heroes and villains had to band together and put aside their differences to save their Earth. Both DC and Marvel did this in their books Crisis on Infinite Earths and Secret Wars. Not this one. This one. Spoilers for these series, by the way, because there is actually a lot of stuff that happens that you can't just predict with common sense like the previous two. Both stories basically end the same way by killing the multiverse and creating a singular prime universe with a singular prime Earth. These stories were both monumental events where it allowed for both the best and lesser known superheroes we know to try their hardest to save everything they know, going up against near impossible stakes. Crisis on Infinite Earths was a year-long comic event that was illustrated by George Perez and written by Marv Wolfman. Wolfman grew up reading comics in the 60s and was a huge fan of the classic Justice Society characters from the late 30s and 40s, the Silver Age Justice League, and all the newer Bronze Age characters in DC. Meanwhile, he was also a very big fan of The Prisoner, a limited TV series which had a very linear and serialized plot that had a concrete start, middle, and end. This led Wolfman to wonder why something like this hadn't been done yet in comics, as he believed it would be a brilliant idea, which I have to agree with him on this, as eventually most of the iconic comic runs for many popular superheroes were limited runs. Eventually, Wolfman became a prominent writer at DC, writing and co-creating the Teen Titans with Perez and working on other books such as Green Lantern. After receiving a letter from a fan who'd pointed out a mix-up in DC continuity, Wolfman started to think about how convoluted things had become, with all the different multiversal doppelgangers of superheroes, different Earths, and slightly different backstories of all these characters. He then partnered with Perez to do so, whilst also completing his dream for writing a limited series for a big comic company such as DC. So, in 1981, Wolfman and Perez announced their story, Crisis on Infinite Earths, a comic that would straighten things out by having some worlds live, some die, but all in all changing the DC universe forever. Okay, don't hate me, but I didn't really enjoy Crisis. Well, that might be a bit harsh, but at times, Crisis on Infinite Earths felt like a bit of a chore for me to read. Although Wolfman and Perez seemed to care about the quality of the story they wrote, especially when the main villain was a childhood OC that Wolfman created, Crisis on Infinite Earths was still pitched as a way to streamline DC Comics into a singular continuity, and you can tell that this was pretty much the sole purpose of it from the start, because the story's main cast of characters and villains that drive the story weren't that interesting in my opinion. The story follows a 10 billion year long dispute between the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor, as the Anti-Monitor, a treacherous Owen, plans to destroy all universes to give him power in his negative universe to rebuild it in his image, whilst the Monitor does everything in his power to stop his negative doppelganger. Whilst these characters were fine, the Monitor twins were both kind of one note, both being relentlessly drawn to their missions. Then there's Pariah, who has the power or curse of being drawn to the destruction of each universe, having to witness it wherever it happens, whenever it happens. I liked the concept of him because he also carries the guilt of feeling like he started the crisis. In his own universe, he used to be a scientist, and he ended up opening a portal where he found the Anti-Monitor. But my issue with the character is that he kind of just repeats himself like a broken record, and due to this, he doesn't have much of a personality other than him being like, "I'm Pariah, I'm so sad that I started this. Oh no, I'm being drawn to another universe to die again. Oh, the pain, oh, the suffering. This curse, but I deserve it because I did this." Next we have Alexander Luthor, who I don't have much of an issue with actually. He was shipped away from his universe Superman style by his parents, Lex Luthor and Lois Lane from Earth 3. And pretty much becomes the Monitor's adopted son and one of the leaders of the team that will save the universe. Due to him being shipped across the multiversal plane, he gets multiversal powers and he becomes a pretty important member of the group. And I think he's my favourite out of all the main characters in this story, other than Barry Allen, who I've been standing since I was 12 years old. We also have Harbinger, who is kind of like the glue that keeps the team together. She was the Monitor's adopted daughter, but also carries the guilt of killing the Monitor near the start of the story whilst under mind control. Next there's the Spectre, an Earth 2 hero, who kind of just appears at one point to Deus Ex Machina one of the battles, which then allows for Earth Prime to be formed. And these specific characters I've mentioned having such power and motion in the story almost made a lot of the several other events and actions that heroes and villains took to feel somewhat redundant, such as Lex Luthor and Brainiac's plan to conquer 5 of the remaining Earths in the multiverse. The story did show a lot of heart and emotion though, with its heroes being near effortlessly courageous and epitomes of hope, staring down the face of eternal nothingness just so they can save the people they love and even the people they don't love. Stakes were definitely high in this story as we see characters die and sacrifice themselves for the cause. Supergirl dies in the first main battle with the Anti-Monitor. Wildcat gets his legs crushed saving a child from an attack in one of the cities. Barry Allen sacrifices himself to destroy the Anti-Monitor's multiversal bomb, and the characters mourn, they feel pain, and it does make you really feel the weight of the story, and that this really could be the end of everything. Despite my knowledge of this being a grand marketing ploy, it ends off with more popular characters from the multiverse being migrated to the Earth 1 continuity, such as Jay Garrick. But as for doppelgangers such as Earth 2 Superman, aka the original Superman from the Siegel and Schuster comics, he doesn't necessarily die, but is transported to a Nirvana-like world inside of Alexander Luthor. Even the death of the multiverse can kill him. Crisis also set out to change the DC universe forever, something that both Marv Wolfman and Dick Giordano both make clear in their introductions and closing statements of the collected edition. Whilst it killed off characters they didn't need anymore, it preserved and gave life to the ones that the creators and publishers believed mattered to help the new readers get into DC. You may be scratching your heads because Barry Allen's Flash dies in this story, but he's then succeeded by his nephew and former sidekick, Wally West, and Wally becomes the mainstay Flash for a long, successful and beloved run, becoming many people's definitive version of the Flash, until Barry got brought back because his time to return had inevitably arrived. Speaking of the Flash, I think I prefer the CW adaptation of Crisis more than the comic, and if that opinion's controversial, I'm gonna stand on it then, because I want to cause some discourse. I dare you to oppose me, say something, do it. But yeah, Crisis, it wasn't necessarily my cup of tea, but it was okay. Had some funny moments.
I'm the only one left who remembers the Infinite Earths. You see, I know the truth. I remember all that happened, and I'm not going to forget. Worlds lived, worlds died, nothing will ever be the same. But those were great days for me. I had a good friend in the good old days, really. He was the Anti-Monitor. He was gonna give me a world to rule. Now he's gone too. But that's okay with me. You see, I'd like to remember the past because those are better times than now. I mean, I'd rather live in the past than today, wouldn't you? I mean, nothing's ever certain anymore. Nothing's ever predictable like it used to be. These days, you just never know who's going to die. And who's going to live.
After getting about halfway through my binge of Crisis, I decided to read Secret Wars next, which I have a much less broad opinion on. Secret Wars was a long saga written by Jonathan Hickman, with Marvel editor Tom Brevoort looking over the story. Unlike Crisis, Secret Wars wasn't pitched or conceptualized with the intent of simplifying continuity and cutting off loose ends that Marvel didn't need to hold on to anymore. Hickman just wanted to write a book where he could play with the idea of the same group of characters dying at the end of every issue because each issue takes place in a different reality. An interesting concept, but I don't have enough context on it to be sold that it would work out, and it seems that Tom Brevoort also thought the same, hence why Hickman then proposed the idea that the book can be called Secret Wars so it could fit under the Marvel publishing umbrella without feeling too out of place. This conversation didn't take place in a formal meeting or summit. It took place in a parking lot. The discussion was to figure out what Hickman would do after his Fantastic Four run, so it did hold some sincerity, but I also feel there was a lot of satire and irony in it, or at least that's my interpretation from the way Hickman recounts the story in this interview. But eventually he developed the story more on the back burner, whilst he continued to work on Fantastic Four, which allowed for him to plant seeds for the big event if it were to ever happen. But Marvel then made a decision to do a big mix-up, where the writers of their flagship books would be swapped around onto other ones. To Hickman's surprise, instead of being able to get straight to work on Secret Wars, he was moved to write the Avengers and the New Avengers before he could get to work on Secret Wars, which actually allowed him to use more than just the FF and Doctor Doom to develop the story. Secret Wars had a lot to say, or a lot to show for itself. Whilst Crisis told a pretty standard story of powerful, omniscient beings destroying the multiverse and did its best to fit in as many characters and give them some sort of highlight or function, Secret Wars took a more complex approach. Secret Wars deconstructed these heroes and allowed us to see them from the inside out, whilst questioning things such as the destruction of the natural order placed by God. When I read the first few issues of Avengers and New Avengers in the omnibus, I saw the initial plot with the incursions and jumped to the conclusion that I was going to be reading the same thing as Crisis, just the Marvel edition. But there was so much more, and that my brain almost crashed from the sheer overflow of information, ideologies, philosophies, and even spirituality that this book throws out. Can you feel that? tectonic plates grinding at the edges, like pieces from different puzzles trying to form a single picture, but they never will. Understand? They don't belong together. It's going to fly apart. I know it is. I devoured everything. I ate it all. But I'm still hungry. Hello, Spider-Man.
Who is...
Oh boy, it's Owen Reese, the Molecule Man.
That's me. Did you bring me something to eat?
I didn't actually know there would be someone down here. I didn't. I'm sorry. No, Owen, I don't have anything.
me? Hey, wait, I forgot. I do have something. There's a hamburger in my pocket.
I have to have it.
How do you forget you have a hamburger in your pocket?
We've been busy.
It's a hamburger.
Hamburgers are what I like. Puberty is rough, Pete. I'm starving all day long, because I'm going to be big.
No, Miles, I mean, where did you get it? Don't say your pocket.
From home, you know? My Earth?
So you're telling me that's an 8-year, 3-week-old hamburger?
I don't think the suspended animation counts.
Okay, so that's a 3-week-old hamburger?
Yeah.
And?
Oh, man. He shouldn't eat that.
Oh, so good. And whilst it was interesting, for the most part, it did feel like Hickman was just shoveling all these ideas in your mouth and at certain points without enough cohesion. The story mostly follows the smartest characters in the Marvel Universe as they try to stop the death of, well, everything in their different groups and methods. Unlike Crisis, the drama and discourse that takes place whilst the incursions take place feels like it matters, because it's a rather deep-rooted discord between the heroes. See what I did there? Join my Discord. There's essentially another civil war going on, but this time it's because of how the Illuminati decided to hide their knowledge of the incursions, which did not sit well with many. But you can't really pick a side as a reader like you could with Civil War because it's a lot more complicated. What do you even tell the world if it's ending and you have no idea how to stop it? Why tell them when you can try to fix things without people causing more of an issue and a panic? Especially when your team consists of these dudes. But on the counter, why gatekeep this crucial knowledge? Don't the other heroes have any value? Can't they help you in any way, shape or form? I mean, isn't that their job? Don't they at least have the right to know about this problem? But eventually it kind of proves right that the Illuminati hid it to themselves for so long, because as they were hiding from Captain America and S.H.I.E.L.D., Yellow Jacket was out there finding the origin of the incursions, the erasure of the universe, and it was a long trip where Hank basically found out that this wasn't just a random freak occurrence. It was a divine action decided by God, or gods, I guess. The Beyonders, who speak in plural terms when referring to themselves, are conducting these incursions, and they make it clear that the heroes are interfering and stepping way above their reach, and it's impossible to win, no matter who they are or how they try. We follow the Illuminati, Namor and the Cabal, the New Avengers, the Maker, and Dr. Doom in their attempts to try and save their universes or prevent the continuation of the Beyonders plot. But the only successful party was Doom's. Doom was somehow able to do the impossible, not only kill gods, but he becomes God. I'm not going to go through all the details of how this happened because I do think you should just read it. It is actually really interesting. But he becomes the Beyonder and God of this new battle world, which also works as the Prime Earth. But Doom's not a capital G God, as we are reminded by Stephen Strange that whilst he's technically omnipotent, as we see him kill Cyclops, who has the powers of the Phoenix with complete ease, he's not omniscient. Whilst he did piece together the world by himself and basically rewrote all that existed to the best of his ability, he didn't do a perfect job, and he couldn't even fix his own disfigured face. He created the world in a fashion that suited him best, whilst even Doctor Strange believed that this battle world needed a god and that Doom is doing good at playing God. Doom is still Doom. He still sees himself a step above everybody else. He creates his castle and his throne to tower above every person. He steals Reed Richards' life and family, and apart from Sue, Valeria and Franklin, Johnny Storm gets killed and basically becomes the sun, and the Thing becomes a massive wall that's supposed to shield all sentient life from zombies for eternity. And when Mr. Fantastic returns and they have their final face-off, Doom admits that even though he did a good job, he knows that if it were Reed, standing before the Beyonders instead of him, if it was Reed who could reshape reality, he knows deep down that Reed believes he would have done a better job. And not only does Mr. Fantastic agree, Doom affirms that he knows it too. And so when he finally loses his power, that's exactly what Reed does, creating a new Prime Earth that was once like the old 616 one, but migrates some multiversal characters from different continuities to the Prime Earth, such as Miles Morales. But a lot of other characters in these continuities that you don't get to see, they're assumed dead with those universes that got destroyed in the incursions. At the end of the story, it does show that Reed and Franklin are working on reforging the multiverse again, and of course we know that this does come to fruition because of the current line of Ultimate books that Marvel are releasing. But I don't think it was necessary to just delete everything that once existed. Once the stories had run their courses and the readers weren't interested in picking them up, wouldn't it have been more respectful and more fair to send off these characters with endings to whatever storylines they were in and leaving the rest of their stories ambiguous for the readers, rather than having literal gods just smite them? I understand the intent of wanting to make comics look less daunting to get into for new readers. Whilst I made the point that superhero comics have become more serialized in recent years compared to the golden and silver ages, meaning these characters grow and evolve, rebooting everything every generation eventually makes things even more confusing, because that means there's more continuities, even though the initial idea was to cut down on how many continuities there already were. So what do? Do we stick with these long-form stories told through comics, seeing these characters we love evolve and develop through several short sagas and long arcs, where this sort of soap opera bingeable style of content can be heralded to the likes of long-form drama television or literature? Or should comics stop being so serial, become more episodic, monthly escapes into fantastic worlds where things rarely evolve yet entertain and teach us things in every evergreen installment? Like a sitcom. Since the beginning of superhero comics, the intent has been to entertain audiences on a consistent basis, whether they're being monthly or weekly releases. Like a sitcom, these forms of media are created to entertain both new and old consumers, particularly for a long amount of time. And when these things are new and fresh, there's near endless opportunity for different stories and characters, but as the writers and artists get more and more used to the formula they've created, their strengths and their weaknesses, that's when they get the episodic format that all these comics fall under. You get the consistently released stories with familiar characters and scenarios that you know you can always return to just by paying a nickel to your local comic book dealer. But at the same time, these characters still have to change. They have to grow, or else everything they've learned or done in these previous stories have taught them absolutely nothing. Imagine if Spider-Man went back to only worrying about himself and the people closest to him after the death of Uncle Ben, disregarding the fact that he has the ability, therefore the responsibility, to help the people that he can with his powers. You'd be confused as to why the writers killed Uncle Ben in the first place. These lessons that the characters learn have to be carried over to their next adventures, or else it'll be for nothing. This doesn't mean that the core ideals of the characters must change constantly or drastically, but over time there will be gradual changes that might make you feel nostalgic for these older stories as you get to see how far these characters have come. And this happens in sitcoms as well as comics. This doesn't really apply to animated sitcoms as much because these characters literally don't have to age, and nobody's gonna get angry about that, as it keeps the content as evergreen and rewatchable as possible, creating endless opportunities for these established avatars and make content forever and ever and ever. Hate it or love it, but I'm gonna use Friends as an example, because I've seen nearly every episode at least twice by letting it play in the background whilst doing more important tasks, such as making these videos. Spoiler warning for the 4 people who haven't seen this show, or for the many people who just don't care. Whilst the show takes place in an episodic format, usually with an A and B plot running simultaneously, the 6 main friends go through a lot of different changes throughout the series. Whilst they start off as 6 good friends and family, living closely to each other and getting into different dumb shenanigans in New York, whether it's based on relationships, careers, or celebrity cameos, the characters change and develop, and in some cases, big updates are made to their world. Jeez, I can't believe I'm talking about the world building of Friends. What am I doing with my life? By the end of the show, Ross and Rachel have a daughter together whilst not being together. Joey goes through the meticulous acting pipeline and gets roles in theatre and soap operas. Monica and Chandler are married, and Phoebe at one point has triplets, but she's a surrogate, so they kind of just don't shop again after they're born. We get to see her go through pregnancy and all the challenges she has to face through it. Whilst there are these big developments to the narrative, people mainly go back for the episodic fun and comfort of knowing that they can put on an episode of this show that they're used to and know what they're investing their time and interest in. Superhero comics are very similar in this way, as these characters don't necessarily have to change their core values and traits, making them still recognizable from the good old days to the people who stick around to get their monthly fix. But when these big changes took place in superhero comics, whether it be the death of Superman, Spider-Man's identity being revealed, the declining success of an alternate timeline, or an insanely large breadth of lore that needs to be simplified to keep new readers from losing their minds, unlike most sitcoms where the network will just pull the plug of the project, the big two won't and most likely can't bank on starting fresh with new heroes, because unlike these sitcoms, comics aren't as expensive to produce, and they aren't bound to the physical limitations of hiring actors that age and get older. They can just restart from wherever they want, whenever they want. They can jump the shark as many times as they want, and bam, retcon. Jump the shark. That's a weird term. Where did I even hear that from again? Okay, you're probably wondering why I've gone from Friends to Rick and Morty, but you should be silent and just listen to my TED Talk. I didn't ask for your opinion. Yet. Comment your opinion. Rick and Morty is one of the most popular adult animated sitcoms, which blew up for being different from what Family Guy or The Simpsons once was. No shade to those cartoons, they hold very special place in my heart also. Rick and Morty is similar in its crudeness and unapologetic comedy, but it also goes to existential and dark places and doesn't just use the material as the setup for a punchline. And as the show progressed, it too followed comics in being a mix between episodic and serial storytelling. The creators Dan Harmon and the now disgraced Justin Roiland wanted to keep telling these endless possible wacky sci-fi existential stories with their characters, whilst developing them and intriguing the viewers. However, they eventually had to catch up with the constant demands from fans who wanted to know more. For example, the outcries from the people who wanted to know about Rick's true backstory back in the day. Now of course, this has been revealed for like 3 years now, but if you were there before season 5, you'll know how many theory channels were eating off the craze over Rick's backstory. I mean, the roundtable were probably swimming in it like Scrooge McDuck. In season 3, we got a small peek into his backstory, but it ended up being a fake. Or so we thought. And eventually we learned the truth that it was only partially fabricated and a lot more was hidden. Dan Harmon has spoken his mind about the people who wanted to know about Rick's backstory so badly and uses the term jumping the shark when doing so.
When do you think Happy Days jumped the shark? I'll say it was 2 seasons before the shark episode.
I met the guy that coined that phrase. He's on Stern, right? The Stern, one of the Stern network shows or something.
This term refers to an episode from the sitcom Happy Days. When they started to run out of ideas, they made an episode where the Fonz jumped over a shark on jet skis. Harmon uses this analogy when referring to revealing secrets or making the unknown known as a way to garner attention, rather than continuing to produce evergreen content. Rick's backstory would be the jumping the shark moment for Rick and Morty because that would be a point of no return. And Rick literally says this in the show. You can't just go back to the same episodic sci-fi adventures after we and Morty learned about the sincere truth behind Rick. Things have to change now because we've made a key progression in the narrative and everything's different now. If you do go back to those meaningless adventures, people are going to be waiting for more progression in the story. The ambiguity of Rick's past was a big part of the appeal of his character. Not only did we not know much about who Rick was, we didn't know much about what Rick was. Personally, I haven't kept up with Rick and Morty since the first half of season 6 and I don't plan on it. Also, I recently watched CJDX's analysis on the show and it tied into a point I wanted to make in this video, hence why this chapter is here in the first place and why it's so short, because I don't want to just plagiarize that video. Just go watch it yourself, it's really good. But the reason I brought up jumping the shark in the first place is because whilst these points of no return have taken place in comics for decades, and certain ones do stick, the editors and writers have the power to erase whatever they want, and have been doing it for longer than I've been alive. The death of Superman is arguably one of the biggest shark jumps in comics, and not too long after that, he just was back. Spider-Man's secret identity being revealed was a huge shark jump, and the editors and the higher-ups used it as a way to erase the marriage of Peter and MJ. Whilst I mainly spoke about Superman and Spider-Man, this has happened across DC and Marvel Comics with a lot of characters. They die and get brought back. Continuities get reset to fit with the time period they're being written in. Like Rick and Morty, One More Day even kind of takes a meta turn in part 2. Doctor Strange literally says that the universe, which is kind of an analogy for the audience, is against Peter going back and stopping Aunt May's death. He affirms that it's just her time and it would be better if he did her the honor of being there as she passes on. But then before he can collect himself and go back to the hospital, he's approached by the devil, which some could say is the editors-in-chief at Marvel, with an evil ultimatum, which literally goes against what the entire universe wants. And they did this mainly with the intention to improve sales, based on the opinions of those in charge. But wait, when you look outside of the US, particularly in the manga industry in Japan, Shonen Jump's best-selling comics either have a reasonable start and ending point, or they're able to sustain serialization for decades without any major continuity resets or retcons. The stories just move forward, and the manga sales in Japan have reached such heights that they've been outselling DC and Marvel. How is this happening? Believe it or not, whilst you could go to most places in the world and show anybody from nearly any age group a picture of Superman and they'd know who he is, the same cannot be said if you were to show a picture of Monkey D. Luffy to this same amount of people. However, manga in general has been skyrocketing in popularity worldwide, and if we look at Shonen Jump as our main example, we can see they run a very different business in comparison to the likes of DC and Marvel Comics. When DC and Marvel heroes were being created, the ones that stuck would be given monthly books, and the ones who became icons would get sister books to satisfy the even higher demand for them. Hence why there would be the Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Sensational Spider-Man running simultaneously. Furthermore, different superheroes would cross over with each other, of course within their respective brands. In The Amazing Spider-Man issue 1, he crosses over with the Fantastic Four. I assume this was done because Stan Lee was writing both books, so he was able to have the FF cameo in Spider-Man without them feeling out of character, but also as a way to boost Spider-Man's ratings because the FF were already established. This wasn't just something Marvel did. DC has been doing this for a long time as well, crossing over Golden Age characters to form the Justice Society, and eventually Silver Age heroes to create the Justice League. Whilst I'm happy that these characters weren't kept in separate continuities and the writers were allowed to cross over these heroes and create team-ups, groups, and fun crossover adventures, it does make things less cohesive, and it can be harder to control things when the characters are constantly overlapping in different stories. Manga in particular is a lot more creator driven than the big two comics are in the West. Whilst we mostly see the same names and heroes in modern superhero comics that we saw back in the Golden and Silver Age, new and fresh manga titles are created and published by Jump on a consistent basis. And the long-running manga titles don't get passed on to new creative teams unless something serious happens to the original mangaka. Jump and many manga magazines alike use a popularity system, where readers can poll which series they are reading and which they aren't, which lets Jump know what series is working and what isn't. Whilst the editors work very closely with mangakas to make sure their manga is as good as possible, where the story ends up going is still very much in the hands of the creator. As I mentioned at the start, Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy is one of the most influential shonen manga to date, and is so iconic and inspirational that one of the most prestigious manga awards that a mangaka can receive in Japan was named after Tezuka. And even with that, Jump never passed on Astro Boy to be serialized forever. The run stayed with Tezuka, like most manga do, and the only other real runs made by different teams was an American-produced Astro Boy comic published by Dark Horse Comics. Then One Piece and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which are two of the most popular and longest-running manga in Shonen Jump, both haven't been through any retcons or reboots. The stories are serial, and the characters progress to the point where some of them are nearly unrecognizable in new chapters. And in extreme cases where the mangaka is too unwell to continue the production of the manga, such as with Yoshihiro Togashi's Hunter x Hunter, or Takehiko Inoue, who struggled to continue the story of Vagabond, these manga have been left on hiatus, and haven't been passed on to assistant artists to be continued. In the case of a mangaka's death, such as with Kentaro Miura, the creator of Berserk, his work had been continued by his assistants, who worked with him nearly every day, which feels more like the manga was still being continued out of a passion, as it was passed on to the team who were already producing it. I do think that I have to address that although the manga industry is very creator driven, which in a lot of ways is really good, it can be very, very taxing. Due to the weekly release schedule of manga, a lot of mangaka are stressed and they have really rough schedules, which has led to the declining health of many mangakas, and in worst case scenarios, early deaths, such as Kentaro Miura. Rest in peace. The few examples of higher up control taking an effect on a manga's serialization due to its popularity is with Dragon Ball. Akira Toriyama's original run of Dragon Ball started off to be pretty similar to his previous manga, Dr. Slump, and had pre-episodic and comedic adventures, although a long-term story was being told as the weekly adventures Goku and Bulma went on were there to lead them to finding the Dragon Balls and eventually meeting more and more characters along the way, to the point where Goku eventually fights Piccolo. But after the time skip that led to the Saiyan saga, everything changes. The manga took a complete turn to long-form serialized storytelling and pretty much abandoned its episodic era. Whilst the series was still under Toriyama's control as he was writing and drawing it, after its initial end, it was brought back in the 2010s with a continuation called Dragon Ball Super. Super's art is drawn by a new main artist called Toyotaru, and Toriyama was plotting the story according to Jump up until he passed away in 2024. Whilst I'm not saying that Toriyama didn't actually work on Super, the vibe does feel pretty different from the original Dragon Ball, kinda like what happened with GT. And the series started after a long drought of Dragon Ball content, because the way I see it, there was no intention for Toriyama to continue making Dragon Ball past that point, because he had finished it in the way he intended. Similar to how Masashi Kishimoto finished Naruto, then a new artist was hired to start working on the continuation of Boruto, which has been eternally hated pretty much since it started serializing due to its major drop in quality. But the difference between something like Boruto and One More Day is that nobody was expecting more Naruto content. The manga had concluded and the story was finished. Whilst Boruto may be a disappointment to many, it's a lot easier to ignore because it takes place after Naruto ends. Whereas One More Day, you can do your best to ignore it, but its effects are everlasting. Peter and MJ's marriage may still exist in the comics before, and you can always go back and read those. But Spider-Man's story wasn't meant to end there, and it still hasn't. There's brilliant Spider-Man comics that have been made since that retcon, but you can't ignore the looming question, because no matter how many new writers have tried to bring them back together, it's never stuck. And it seems like she's stuck with Paul now. Since One More Day, Peter got his body stolen from him by Doc Ock, died, came back because comics, and has gone back to university several times whilst people are constantly pissed at him. The problem isn't just the retcons themselves, but it's the precedent they've now set for superhero comics. These stories don't stick because these characters won't be allowed to progress too far. They might make these new reimagined continuities like the Ultimate and Absolute universes, but if history repeats itself, they'll eventually get cancelled or keep the characters that people still care about while dumping the rest. I'm aware this video has made me seem like a pessimistic snob for the most part, but I actually have high hopes for the Ultimate Universe books. The Absolute line is really cool and I have a lot of faith in it, and Jonathan Hickman's Ultimate Spider-Man run has been a big deal since it dropped, so I don't think the Ultimate line's going anywhere anytime soon either. Yo, Future Taffy here? Yeah, I wrote that a few days before Marvel had announced the cancellation of Ultimate Spider-Man. So, that stinks. Whilst this change might not last since it's been announced to end in December, that's still annoying since it's made my point both true and untrue, because another Spider-Man comic has been canned, one where we get to see Peter as an adult, married to MJ, with kids, one where Peter actually could catch a break for once instead of being cucked. But no, apparently it's over. Meanwhile, the mainline Peter continues to go through predictably unpredictable torture in the name of maintaining the Spidey that's best for us.
What is that?
I don't actually know how to introduce this part because I forgot to write an intro to it. I kind of got some cliff notes, and I'm gonna just talk to you guys for a bit, and I also cannot see right now. Yeah, I have the shiesty under this, my hair's kind of wet, so I needed something to not ruin this.
Bruh.
But yeah, don't mind this. Just listen, okay? So, about creators' input on creating comics and manga. One of my favorite mangas of all time right now is Chainsaw Man. You probably know of it because you've probably seen the memes and the Makima simps because they're everywhere. And the new movie's coming out soon, and if I get this out on time, maybe I wouldn't have seen it yet. I don't know, we'll see. But the reason why I brought it up is because, say the creator of Chainsaw Man, Tatsuki Fujimoto, were to fall ill or to not want to work on it anymore, but because it was such a big phenomenon with the internet and with the fans, Shueisha and Shonen Jump just said, no, we're keeping the ball rolling, and it just kept getting passed on to creator after creator. I don't think it would hit the same at all, because Chainsaw Man is one of the most creator-driven projects I've ever seen. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before because of the way that Fujimoto thinks. He doesn't think like a normal human being, and like I've said in previous videos, his presence on the internet says so. I mean, there's the video of him levitating, there's his song about food, and there's his Twitter accounts. I'm not getting into that right now, I can't bother. But with that being said, just because in that instance where something like Chainsaw Man couldn't be replicated by someone else and wouldn't hit the same, does that necessarily apply to Marvel and DC characters? Because we also have to think about the intention of why these were created. I'm not saying Stan Lee or Jack Kirby or some of these other creators didn't care about the characters that they made. I'm pretty sure they weren't made to have a whole overarching story like Chainsaw Man or manga in general, but that doesn't mean that these creators and their touch on the comic isn't as impactful as the likes of Tatsuki Fujimoto with Chainsaw Man or his other mangas like Fire Punch and his one-shots. Whilst I was writing the script to this video, I started reading The Crow, which is a beautiful independent comic created by James O'Barr. And once again, that story is also extremely personal to O'Barr, and just because it became a cult classic with different fans and different niches, doesn't mean that it can just become this huge franchise. I'm aware that there are different versions of The Crow, and there's the movies and the failed projects, but The Crow is still mainly a standalone story about Eric, the main character. And unlike, say, Superman or Batman or Spider-Man or Wonder Woman, I can't see The Crow in any other way or form than that one comic or the movie starring the late Brandon Lee. So, should comics be left to their original creators? It's not that simple. It's a yes and no answer. While on one hand, the creators might put so much themselves into it, it's low-key impossible to move on these characters and stories to a new team because it just won't be the same. But on the other hand, I do think that it's a good thing that comics have moved on from their original creators, because with Spider-Man, for example, like I showed in the One More Day segment, when that fan was talking to Joe Quesada on the panel, Quesada said something very important. He said that whilst in Civil War, when Peter was living in the apartment, not luxuriously, but living definitely comfortably, a lot of people were complaining because they don't think Peter Parker should just be living this easy life. You know, he goes through hardships, he goes through struggles. And whilst I don't agree with everything Quesada said on that panel, it did get me thinking, what is Spider-Man, or what makes Spider-Man? Who makes Spider-Man? Because Stan Lee obviously gave us this intention of him just being a flawed human being who goes through all these hardships like you and me do. But at the same time, he wasn't always depressed. He would get small wins, like the time where he was able to pay for the rent for Aunt May. And when he met MJ, you know? And then there's also these brilliant Spider-Man stories that are written by other writers and drawn by other amazing artists. And honestly, I prefer some of these stories to some of Stan Lee's work. They're all Spider-Man. Just because Lee wasn't writing doesn't mean it isn't Spider-Man. It's weird and funny because superheroes have changed in a way that it's become more of a communal thing. It's not about one person behind the characters. It's about everyone and their input on the characters. There's a reason why there's so many different debates and power scaling and all this different other stuff on why and what superheroes should be. And I kind of like it. I like that we all get to have our own input on these characters and not just us sitting here, but different writers. Like, there's so many kids who grow up wanting to draw Spider-Man for Marvel, wanting to draw Superman, wanting to draw Batman or Aquaman or Animal Vegetable Mineral Man. And that's actually quite a good thing because it inspires people to create art, even if it's not necessarily their own characters. These icons, in a way, are our own characters because we put ourselves into them, the fans put themselves into them, and we end up all creating this one beautiful big collage that we then compile into a superhero. I mean, look at Into the Spider-Verse. Look how many people worked on that movie alone. Like that Lego scene, they hired that 14-year-old kid to make that. You know, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but superheroes just aren't gatekept. They're for everybody. And whilst I adore and love manga for how personal these pieces are and how brilliant the art is, it's hard to compare them because they're clearly not the same, because there's clearly a massive cultural and corporate difference between, say, Marvel and DC, or, you know, Shonen Jump or Seinen Jump. Is there a Seinen Jump? And now I'm going to transition into talking about Hollywood. We complain a lot about Hollywood reboots and remakes, but comics have been doing that forever. They've been doing this for a long time. I don't think I've seen anyone actually complain about new writers taking over these same comic IPs. Yes, it's a different medium, I understand, and film and comics are not the same thing and you can't just compare them, but are all these reboots and IP movies bad? On one hand, yes, it's a capitalist agenda. They're trying to kill original creators' movies. New movies aren't being greenlit because of this. Put fire in Hollywood now. But on the other hand, we kind of need them. Last year I made a video about Transformers 1 and how I thought it was the best Transformers movie in a long time. In fact, I think I said of all time. Is that controversial? I don't care. But the point being said, if we didn't have that reboot and we just stuck with the Michael Bay verse, yeah, some of those movies are fun. What am I talking about? One of those movies are fine. But we wouldn't have that many good Transformers movies to pull from. And is that necessarily fair? And hey, look, imagine if Marvel never made Spider-Verse because how many Spider-Man movies already exist? We wouldn't have one of the greatest animated films of, you know, the past 20 years, in my opinion at least. And the reason why we're against these Hollywood IP movies isn't just because they're not giving creators that much of a chance to tell their stories and, you know, let the world see their art. I think we're also just mad because they're bad. Like, let's not lie here, a lot of these movies aren't good. They're like 5 out of 10s at best. That's been the main issue with the MCU for the past few years and why I haven't seen an MCU movie since, I don't know, Black Panther 2. Since then, they haven't really been great. They've all just been average because Hollywood doesn't need to try because they still pull in numbers anyways. But we need to stop letting them know this. Because comics have so much creator control, even when these writers are writing for characters that have existed for so long, it allows for us to get better quality stuff because these writers care about what they do and they have passion for their craft. But with Hollywood, it's not that the creators and the directors and the writers and producers don't have care for their craft. It's more that this is more of a business. Whilst comics are a business too, movies are like a whole different deal. The people who put money and budget into these things, they're basically investing them into them like real estate. They don't care if the movie's good itself. They care if they make back their money. What we need to do is show them we aren't standing for that nonsense. I'm not the first person to say this, but show them that we're not standing for bad quality stuff anymore. I don't go to the cinema anymore unless I'm sure the movie will be at least okay. How? I look at other people's reviews, trusted sources. Also, I make my own opinions and inputs too, because who knows, you might like something if somebody else doesn't. I think the last thing I saw was Weapons, and that was actually pretty good. that was good. Now to get a little more personal, but not really personal. I make comics from time to time. I've made comics before, put them on the internet. Some weren't good, but you can read them if you want. I'll link them if you want. My point being said, would I want someone else writing or drawing the comics that I created back when I was, I don't know, 14, 15? I don't know. That's the thing, I don't know. I own them fully because, you know, no one wanted to publish my work. But say for example Super Nobody, which was a comic book strip that I created when I was like 14 or 15, and it was about this unknown superhero who would go around, you know, doing superhero shenanigans, and you know, it wasn't that funny, I'm sorry. And you know, it was just a little comic. If someone else said, yo, can I continue this? I don't know if I would say no, because I really do like the character and the concept, and just because I haven't had the passion to keep going with it doesn't mean that nothing else should come from it. Or at least that's what I think. But with that being said, actually, I'm gonna keep this to myself, okay? Sorry. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there because I wanted to show you guys that I do have a little bit of stakes in the game when it comes to making comics. So I wanted to apply this to myself and, you know, think personally how I would feel if stuff like this was happening. And also, guys, please support comic creators. I think if you know a bit about comics, you'd know about all the disputes between artists in Marvel and DC back in the 50s and 60s, such as the late great Jack Kirby. Because of bad contracts, Jack Kirby didn't get to really own any of the characters he created. Of course, the people remember and love him, but he didn't really get to reap what he sowed and get the rewards that he truly deserved. I'm not trying to throw any shade at Stan Lee because there's no point, but while Stan Lee was the front man for a lot of the Marvel characters that you know and love, he didn't have a hand in creating all of them, and he definitely didn't do it all by himself. Go and research this stuff. Go and look into comic creators. Go and look into the history of how these comics were made. You know, a lot of people didn't get their credit until, I don't know, well after it was too late. I mean, I don't know when it started happening, but only recently did Bill Finger start getting credited for the creation of Batman. Of course, he didn't create Batman alone. Bob Kane did have maybe a little bit of input into it, but Bill Finger created a lot of the stuff that we know and love about Batman. His backstory, the vibes, a lot of that stuff was all pushed by him. Search up Bob Kane, just do your research. I don't need to do this for you. I'm here to entertain, I'm here to educate, but also to inspire you. So go and read. Okay. That's enough for my TED Talk. I guess to round this tirade off, I want to say that this video wasn't supposed to be why superheroes staying around forever is bad, or something like that. I made this because it really fascinated me that although editors and higher-ups keep these characters alive and make all these retcons to keep up with the times and stay relevant enough to sell better or to appeal to new readers, some of these retcons have pissed off fans to a large extent and ended the possibilities for unexplored storylines. Meanwhile, the manga industry has been dog-walking US comic sales because they understand that in some cases, it's fine to let characters grow and allow these characters to change to the point where they're practically whole new people in their current appearances in contrast to their first. They understand development. You don't just have to kill off characters because you want to shock the world, but you can tell narratives about loss and grief that can truly resonate with your readers. But at the same time, I do get it. These superheroes have become more than just characters. They're symbols for hope and for a better world. Like I said earlier, a lot of these characters have become priceless, and it almost feels impossible to imagine a world without them now. In a way, the heroes from Marvel and DC are like the gods from Greek mythology, but their stories are still being told to this day. I'm not saying Superman should have stayed dead after Doomsday killed him, but they could have made more use out of this event with even more planning on how this event could affect DC in the long run. I also love episodic storytelling, and recently I've been more in favour of it because it's difficult to always invest time in long-form serialized stories. Hence why I've been recently consuming a lot of media that follows an episodic format, such as shows like Atlanta, Cowboy Bebop, or older Marvel and DC comics. And I wanted to say that the fact that these stories progress so far, with these characters developing so much, is actually really good. It allows for readers to be attached to these characters, enjoy digestible bites of content with the occasional limited runs and serialized plots to shake things up. But to keep things accessible to the widest demographic possible, the writers don't need to just forcefully kill off characters, reset continuities, or shut down less profitable ones. I'm sure it can get confusing, but honestly, I'd rather try to navigate DC's pre-Crisis multiverse rather than dealing with all the resets such as going from post-Crisis to the New 52 and then to DC Rebirth and whatever the hell they're doing now with the mainline books. Then when I look at Ultimate Spider-Man from last year, it made me think that this whole time, Marvel shouldn't have done one more day. Peter's story shouldn't have halted. They could have just done what they've done before and started a separate continuity where they can mess around with Peter's relationships, his youth, and soap opera style drama as much as they want. I'm aware that rebooting these heroes in different continuities hasn't always been successful, but I do think it could save a lot of backlash from fans, whilst also appealing to new and old readers. But as made clear by Marvel for the past 18 years, they decide how to make these comics, not us. If you are new to comics, I hope this video didn't scare you away. That's not what I was intending to do here. It may have been really difficult to start reading them in the 1980s, but not anymore. You can figure out which characters you want to start reading first, then look up some books that tell their origin stories so you get the gist of things. Then you can start picking and choosing from the different runs there are from different writers. If you're bothered by certain stories like Spider-Man vs. Paul or the Dark Knight Returns sequels, you can do what I do. Ignore them, and just read what you like. That's one of the good things that came from the immortality of these heroes. There is so much to choose from. And whilst you may desire that perfect, happy storybook ending, it's probably already happened at some point, and you can shape the stories of these characters to fit your own needs, create your own headcanons, you can make your own continuity, for the most part. Hey, subjectivity, she's a hard girl to hate, so yeah. I've been Taffy. This video spiraled into places that I did not expect when I first got the idea. Like, seriously, this was supposed to be 15 minutes long. Subscribe, please, I need it to stay sane. I told myself I'd take a break from these longer videos, but I clearly can't help myself at this point. Comment whether you agree with anything I said or the opposite. I love the good, healthy discussion, and also it really helps with the algorithm. And I think that's all I have to say. I'm gonna go and watch some Interdimensional Cable. Later, nerds. Wait a second. MJ broke up with Paul? There is hope in this world. Thank you, Jesus.